and welcome to the Introduction to Geospatial Metadata, focusing on the ISO standards. Today's session is on the ISO 101. It's a general overview on content and organization of the standard. Again, I am Jackie Mize. I'm with NOAA's National Coastal Data Development Center. We're a division of NODC. And Kathy Martin-Olich is also the other trainer. She's at NCDDC as well. If you could, please email a list of participants at each location. So if you have several people in a conference room, please email that list of participants to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. And that way we can kind of keep track of who's been attending, and that way we can keep an accurate count of metrics. There is a chat window, but there's also a questions window in your software, the GoToWebinar software. So if you have questions, you can do that. Or if you want something to be answered offline, you can email questions to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. And hopefully at the end of today's session, we'll have a little bit of time to answer any questions if you have any. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Also in the chat window, I have put a link to the materials that are online, the FTP site. If it asks for a username and password, don't fill anything in, just hit OK, and that should work. Okay, here's a list of our resources, and the materials again are on the FTP, and that link again is in your chat window, so that you can copy and paste that easily. Also, anywhere where you see this green icon, that means there's further information about that topic on that slide. If you click on that link, it actually will take you to the NOAA EDM, which is the Environmental Data Management Wiki, and that has a lot more examples and other information that may be beneficial to further enhancing the understanding of that topic. And again, the workbooks are in the on the FTP in the series materials, and also on the ncddc.noaa.gov/metadata-standards page. So today we're going to cover, okay, why ISO metadata? Why are we using that? Then we're going to cover, what is ISO metadata, and then the general overview about how ISO, what kind of information is contained in ISO, and how it's organized. All right, we're going to start with why ISO metadata. Each country may have their own policy and standard or profile of a standard set, but we're going to focus on the United States and the ISO recommended standards. I know that a lot of other countries recommend the ISO standards as well, but I'm just going to kind of cover the United States policy on some of that. All right, Executive Order 12906 was signed by President Bill Clinton on April 11, 1994. This executive order established the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, the NSDI, to support public and private sector applications of geospatial data in such areas as transportation, community development, agriculture, emergency response, environmental management, and information technology. This executive order also established an electronic National Geospatial Data Clearinghouse for the NSDI to address data standardization and to make geospatial data publicly available and address redundancy and incompatibility of geospatial information. Several objectives were defined to promote the population of the NSDI with geospatial data held by federal agencies and other organizations. These include an inventory of spatial data holdings, development of a plan to document new spatial data sets. It calls for the documentation of all data sets created after January 11, 1995, and the placement of descriptive information, known as metadata, in an online searchable service as of January 1995. The government was supposed to follow these and make metadata searchable online, and have online access to spatial data sets through metadata wherever feasible. OMB Circular A-16, it was actually recently, well, it was revised in 2002, and I think it was revised again since then. But this is a government circular that was created by the United States Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, to provide guidance for federal agencies that create, maintain, or use spatial data directly or indirectly through the establishment of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, NSDI, and the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the FGDC. The circular establishes guidelines for the management of digital spatial data and the use of those standards. It also appoints the FGDC to the interagency coordinating body for NSDI-related activities. The FGDC is an interagency organization, interagency committee delegated to manage the OMB Circular A-16 related activities and the implementation of the NSDI policy and procedures in accordance with existing federal law and policy. And this applies to any agency that collects, produces, acquires, maintains, distributes, uses, or preserves any form of spatial data, either directly or indirectly, with any other agency or organization must follow the policies set forth by this circular. In September of 2010, the FGDC Steering Committee endorsed 64 non-federally authored standards, including the ISO 191 series. The FGDC policy states that non-federally authored standards that are endorsed by the FGDC have the same status as an FGDC approved and developed standard, such as several of you may be familiar with the CSDGM, which is the content standard for digital geospatial metadata, or the biological profile or remote sensing extensions to that. Since the ISO 19115 and the associated standards are endorsed by the FGDC, federal agencies are encouraged to transition to ISO metadata as their agencies are able to do so. So this is why we're moving and doing metadata using the ISO standards. All right, so now we're going to get into, okay, what exactly is ISO metadata? ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. It's the world's largest developer of voluntary international standards. It was founded in 1947. ISO is a network of national standards bodies, and the national standard bodies throughout the international community make up the ISO membership, and they represent ISO for their country. Because International Organization for Standardization would have different acronyms in different languages, their founders decided to give it the short form ISO. And ISO is derived from the Greek isos, meaning equal. So whatever the country, whatever the language, the short form of this organization is always ISO. So these are it's the 191 series. The 19115, it's about geographic information metadata. The 19115-2, a lot of times you'll hear it just referred to as the -2. That's the geographic information metadata, part 2, extensions for imagery and gridded data. The 19139, that's the geographic information metadata, the XML schema implementation. The 19110, that's the geographic information methodology for feature cataloging. You'll hear that referred to as the feature catalog. And the 19119, it's the geographic information services extensions of the service metadata model. Don't worry if all these numbers don't make sense right now. We'll walk through exactly how all of these standards relate to each other. All right, the core for standard ISO, the ISO standard for documenting geospatial data is the ISO 19115, the geographic information metadata. All right. It contains all of the basic information, such as the who, what, when, where, and why about, what's the identification, what's the title of this resource, who produced this resource, who created the metadata, is this process. It has a lot of the, how is it distributed. It has a lot of that core basic information. You'll always see the 19115 start with MD_metadata. So you'll always see MD, the first tag. The ISO 19115-2, Geographic Information Metadata, Part 2, extensions for imagery and gridded data, they extend the 19115 in order to properly document information about imagery, gridded data, remotely sensed data, and instrumentation. So anytime that something is collected in situ or you have instrumentation used, you can use the -2. And what that does is takes the 19115 core information and simply adds acquisition information. How is this data acquired? The ISO 19110, Geographic Information, the feature catalog, it's a separate standard and a separate document that the ISO 19115 or the -2 will reference if it exists. The reason for this is that it's a separate XML document is that a lot of times you'll have the same parameters captured in different data sets. So you only have to write the attributes and their properties, what units it's measured in, what parameters were captured. You only have to really define that one time using the feature catalog, and then any metadata that uses that, you can just reference to that document. So it's a reusable piece, if you will. The ISO 19139, that defines the XML encoding of the ISO metadata standards. The ISO 19139 provides the structure and the rules to which the validation should be set. So a lot of times you'll hear it's ISO 19139 compliant. That means it could be the ISO 19115-2 or the 19115, and then it's compliant according to the XML validation. Anywhere that you see an MI underscore metadata tag, that means that it's using the -2 set of rules and valid, standard. So that's the 19115-2. The ISO 19119, that's services metadata. That actually is found within the 19115. In the identification information, you can either have data identification or services identification. And what that does is provide a place in which you can document a lot of services, such as web mapping services, a lot of that type of information. The ISO 19157, it's actually in the draft form, but will be approved this year. That is your data quality section. Currently, data quality is found within the 19115, but the next revision, they're actually going to pull that out into the 19157, because a lot of times you'll have the same data quality activities going on for a lot of your data collection. So instead of rewriting that piece over and over again, you can define it once and just point to it. Now, the ISO metadata standards, every 5 years they undergo a revision cycle, and that's just to make sure that they stay up to date with community needs and new technologies that emerge. So ISO metadata, it's pretty flexible. It has a very few core elements that are mandatory, and the rest are if it's applicable to your data set, then you should apply them. ISO introduces a structured hierarchy for the documentation of related levels of data, including a data set series, data sets, features, data attributes. You can actually show true parent-child relationships through ISO metadata. Many new geospatial technologies have emerged, such as web mapping, data models, online data catalogs, online data processing, different ontologies, thesauri, data hierarchies, and classification systems. And so you can really use ISO to exploit those relationships and documenting that information. And to accommodate the writing of metadata for multiple nations and international organizations, ISO includes elements to be able to record your data set language, your data set character set, the metadata language, and the metadata character set. So again, that really helps define it too on the international scope. They have standardized descriptors through the use of code lists. So a lot of places are either going to be free text or a character string, or you'll have defined code lists that you can pick from. And again, it undergoes revision, review every 5 years so that it's up to date with the user community's needs. All right, so now we're going to go into, okay, the 19115, how ISO is organized. All right, so ISO contains information, again, metadata, it's data about your data. Metadata written ISO will answer important questions such as who, what, when, where, how, and why. Who collected the data, who processed the data, who wrote the metadata, who to contact for questions, who to contact to order this data, who owns this data, where's the data collected and processed, where's the data currently located, when's the data collected, when was it processed, you know, what time parameters does this cover, what's the data about, is this data associated with another project, are there any constraints on the use of the data, what is the quality, what are the appropriate uses, what parameters are measured, and format is the data in. How is the data collected and how is it processed? Can you access the data, and if so, how can you order it? Does it have any costs associated with it, and how was the quality assessed? And then also, why was the data collected in the first place? All right, if you kind of step back and look at ISO, it's generally broken out into sections and packages. A section is going to be kind of like groupings of similar information, where a package is logical groupings of elements found in multiple locations within sections. We'll kind of show how that is here in a minute. All right, these would be what I would call the main sections of ISO metadata. And again, this one is the 19115 main sections because we can tell that with the MD underscore metadata tag. The root MD underscore metadata contains information about the metadata itself, and then it contains these main sections. Okay. Again, it'll start with this. It contains information about the metadata, and then it contains these other main sections, such as spatial representation information, which is the geospatial representation of the resource. So any information that you need to document about your data set about the spatial representation will go in this section. The reference system information section, this is where you know, projection information, spatial and temporal reference systems used, that's where that information will be documented in this section. The metadata extension information, that section is used if you take the standard and you extend it or use certain profiles. This is where you describe that information, such as if I've added the biological extensions, and so I now have some tags that relate to the biology or the taxonomic information, this is where I document that I use the biological profile and what additions have I made to the standard here. The identification information section, this is where your main info about your data lives. This is where the title, the abstract, the purpose, the originator, all that information belongs in the identification information section. The content information section, this is where you say, document where the physical parameters and other attributes contained in a resource, and this is also where you reference to your feature catalog. So you'd provide a link or a citation to the feature catalog that you're using. The distribution information section, this is the information that you, this section is where you put who makes this resource available and how do you get it? How can I order it? Is it available online or offline? What media and format is it in? The data quality information section is where the quality and lineage, including all the processing steps and sources of a resource belong. The portrayal catalog, this section is where you document a collection of defined symbols used to depict to humans features on a map. The metadata constraint information section is where you document the constraints on the use of the metadata and the resource it describes. Now, that's the metadata constraint information. Now, constraint information on the data itself actually belongs in the identification information section because that's the main information about the data itself. Well, whereas the metadata constraint information, that's the constraints on the use of the metadata. The application schema information section, this is where you document application schemas that are used to build a data set. And the metadata maintenance information, this is the information, this section is where you document the maintenance of the metadata, how often has this metadata been updated, who's responsible for its update, and that kind of information belongs there. All right, now we're going to look at the main sections of the 19115-2. And we can tell that these are the -2 because it starts with MI_metadata. Okay, and so what this does is it extends the ISO 19115 specifically for imagery and gridded data. The root of the ISO 19115 metadata records change from MD_metadata to MI_metadata when using the 19115-2. And it takes all of the same information, all these same sections, and then a new section is added called acquisition information. And again, so MI metadata contains information about the metadata itself, and then it contains all of these main sections. And all of these are the same. And then acquisition information is added, and this is where you document information about the instruments, platforms, operations, and other info about how the data is acquired. All right, I'm going to kind of show you a little bit more visuals about, I'm going to show you a UML diagram and some other visuals about how this root contains information about the metadata itself and then other packages, other sections. So you would have MD metadata or MI metadata, and it contains all of this information about the metadata itself, such as the file identifier of the metadata, the language of the metadata, the character set of the metadata, parent identifier, the hierarchy, if it's a data set or collection level, the contact, which is the responsible party for the metadata, the date stamp, which is the date stamp for the metadata standard name and version, the dataset URI, and the locale. The date stamp and the contact information that's found in identification information section is going to be different from the found in metadata. So you'll actually see an MD metadata tag or MI, then you'll see all the information about the metadata itself, and then you have these main sections or packages that branch off of that, such as the spatial representation information, the reference system, the metadata extension information, identification information, the application schema, portrayal catalog, content info, distribution, and data quality, just like in here. These are your main sections. So all of these main sections branch off of the MD metadata. Here's another kind of visual how this looks. You'll have the root, MD metadata, and then you'll have each of these elements here in this red box describe the metadata itself. And then you also have these packages, which are those other main sections about, spatial representation info, reference system information, metadata extension information, identification information, content information, distribution information, data quality information, portrayal catalog information, metadata constraints, the application schema information, and metadata maintenance. So you see here's the root, here are these tags, and then at the same level you have these. All right, here's how this looks like in the XML. You'll see the root, which is MD_metadata, so we know this is using the 19115. Then we have the elements here in the red box that describe the metadata itself. So the date stamp, that's going to be the date stamp for when the metadata was created. If you want to find out when the data was created, you're going to look in identification information section. If you want to find out the title of the data set, you need to look down here inside of inside of identification information section, because these elements in the red box are elements that describe the metadata. Then these main sections here describe each of those main sections about of the resource that you're documenting. Again, the spatial reference info, the reference system information, metadata extension information, identification information, content info, distribution info, and so on. All right, you may have noticed that some of the XML has a 2-letter code followed by an underscore, and you saw that in some of the previous slides. An example, CI underscore responsible party, or MD underscore, or MI underscore. ISO is organized into groups called packages, and these are kind of like supporting sections found within the main section. So these packages can be found in multiple places within the main section. If you see CI, that means that it's going to be information that's going to be a package about the citation. DQ is data quality. DS is for data set. EX means extent, so any of the spatial or temporal information, the extent of the data set or other resource is going to be found in the EX package within one of those main sections. FC is the feature catalog. GM is geometry. LE, you're only going to find this in the -2 because this is lineage extended. LI, you'll find in the MD, which is lineage, but the -2 actually will take the lineage package and have more information, so it'll extend the lineage package. MD is metadata. MI is metadata for imagery, and that's the root for the -2. RS is reference system, and QE is data quality extended. The 19115 will have DQ, which is data quality, and in the -2, you can either use the data quality or the data quality extended, which is the QE. All right, so now we're going to get into how to actually implement some of this ISO metadata. So you're going to be able to identify where certain information belongs with the ISO metadata standard and the valid format of that entry in there. Because the ISO standards, you actually have to pay and buy them. In the links where I listed the names of the standards, those are actually the links to the ISO community, to the ISO page where you can buy those standards. But there are free workbooks that we developed that parallel the standard. These workbooks basically take a lot of the information that are in that standard and kind of make them a working copy that's freely distributable. And it's more of a guide to implementing the 19115 or the -2, and also the feature catalog. And it has this parallels the standards. It provides frequently asked questions and a lot of examples, and it really acts as more of an implementation guide. Again, this is a resource for applying the ISO metadata standard. It provides names and definitions. It describes domain values, valid values that can be assigned to that data element, and it uses the graphical representation of the production rules. And there's also all the UML in the back as one of the references in the back. And again, we'll cover more about how to read the UML in the February 5th session on UML basics. So again, the workbook is a resource for applying the ISO metadata standard and its profiles. It provides names and definitions, describes the domain values, and uses that graphical representation of the production rules. The workbook is organized by main sections and supporting packages. The main sections are documented in the order in which they appear in the standard, and the packages are referred to from various points within the main sections and other packages. All the packages in the workbook are documented in alphabetical order. And the workbook includes selected graphics, geographic information metadata standard implementation guide, as well as the feature catalog standard implementation guide. The workbook also documents differences between the ISO standard and a North American profile, which is a profile of the ISO. The workbook is structured as follows. The file identifier is an example of that structure. You'll see this right here will be what the XML tag is, and then this will be a definition of the type of information that belongs there. You'll have a unique phrase or string that uniquely identifies that metadata file. The type, it's GCO character string, which means I can put free text in that tag. This is optional according to the standard, but if you use something like the North American profile, then that's a mandatory best practice. The attributes that are allowed here is nil reason, so that we'll go over more about the attributes in the XML basics next week. And then it also would list best practices, which is the recommended implementation. And for file identifier, the recommended best practices, each metadata record should have a universal unique identifier, UUID, to distinguish it from others. The graphics were in the workbook are automatically generated from the actual ISO schemas using some software that we use, and the graphics were then cleaned up to provide easier to read graphical representations of the standard. The legends of symbols required to read the graphics is provided here, and additional symbols are the result of the automated software and really not considered necessary to understanding of the standard. Each name in each box is the XML tag, so whatever word or phrase you see here, that's the XML tag. This means a sequence. This symbol means a choice, a switch. If it's a solid line or box, that means it's mandatory. If it's dashed, that means it's optional. If it's yellow, that means it's conditional. Go and look at it and see if it really applies or if there's some other things that you need to have to meet validation. The repeatability of a tag or an element is noted. It'll have 0 to N. You'll also see boxes that look like they're expanded or closed. The plus looks it's closed but can expand further, and the minus shows that it is open, is showing the expansion. So here's what it looks like. Here's what again, the standard, the workbook actually looks like. And remember, ISO is arranged a little funny. The MD metadata root or MI metadata root contains all the information about the metadata itself and then these main sections. All right, so you'll see here, the workbook, you see MD metadata, it's the root entity. It's a compound, so it contains other elements. And within it, you'll see file identifier, okay, that's optional. And the information that goes into file identifier, well, it's unique phrase or string, and it's free text I could put there, but the best practice is to use a UUID. Here you have language, and that's the language of the metadata composed in an ISO, and then it has how that information should be filled out for that element. So the language element, it's saying that you should use the ISO 639-2/T 3-letter language code and an ISO 3166-1 3-letter language code. And then it kind of tells you in best practices, here's how you should document it in that following manner. So it kind of goes through exactly how you should document it. And then there's also these references are found in the appendix. And then it also has an FAQ. All right, so how do I actually use this? How do I populate the element language for a data set composed in English from the United States? So following this guide, this best practice, that shows you what it should look like. And then there's further references in Annex B. So this just kind of walks you through parent identifier. You see that's yellow. It just has, it's a conditional. Parent identifier is documented when the hierarchy of a higher level exists. So even though that's optional, but if there is a higher hierarchy level that it needs to reference, then you should put that in there. You'll see things that are a solid line. Again, that means that contact for the metadata is mandatory. and it's repeatable. File identifier, you'll notice, is not repeatable. It does not have any repeatability. So it says here multiplicity optional. So this is optional, but contact is mandatory and repeatable. Hierarchy level, this is optional and repeatable. You know, and it tells you here in the multiplicity in the text, it just reinforces what the graphic shows you. So that's kind of how you marry the workbook text with the workbook graphics. Again, if you have any questions, you can email ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. We also have some time today to go over a couple of questions. Also, please do not forget to email a list of your participants at your location to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov as well. All right, I see we have some questions. We have hand raised. Asmat Ali?
Yes, please, ma'am. I'm from Pakistan, and my question is that why I should go for ISO? Why I should not go for other metadata standards? Thank you.
Why you should use the ISO metadata standard? Well,
yes.
That actually depends a lot on your requirement. The United States has a requirement to document using a metadata standard that the committee, that the FGDC has recommended, and FGDC has recommended ISO. I know that Europe uses the Inspire, which is a profile of the ISO standards. And the ISO really is an international community. So if you want to get the most interoperability of your data and sharing, especially between countries, the ISO 191 series is really the standard to use so that it's more interoperable with other data sets and sharing that information around the world. But again, that really depends on your organization's policy and your government policy of what you need. But again, especially in the academic sector, everybody's moving toward the ISO.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tanya, I'm sorry if I'm butchering any names. Tania? All right. All right, a question, are the materials on the FTP site available to provide academic research teams via a website? May we post these videos on a secure site available only to academic researchers for their review? Anything we post on the FTP is public domain. We would just ask that if you could please cite NOAA's National Coastal Data Development Center and just reference them back there, but it's public domain to use as you need. Let's see. David Anderson, did you have a question?
Yes. Can you tell me if there is a executive order or another modification to the OMB Circular A-16 that is going to direct all USGS, or well, actually all federal compilations for vector data and raster data to have this ISO standard?
Well, the Executive Order 12906 and the updated OMB Circular A-16 never identify a specific standard, just ones that the FGDC recommends. That's how the language reads in those actual policies. And the FGDC has recommended moving to ISO and using the ISO standards. So whereas the actual policy is not standard explicit, it does say to use the ones endorsed by the FGDC, and FGDC has endorsed these.
Okay, but they also have others that are endorsed, correct?
They do, but they're never going to unendorse a standard, but the FGDC currently recommends everybody use these ISO standards.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is because we use a feature level metadata as well as a database level metadata record within the National Hydrography data set. And if we are going to modify a database standard, then I need to have something that directs us to do so. And I'm not sure whether I can stand by just the A-16 as that standard or as that directive.
Right. The latest FGDC, let me see if I can pull that up. All right, the latest FGDC endorsed standards, that's what they're saying, you know, to go to these standards according to the FGDC, and their latest, you know, should our agency been using ISO metadata? This is kind of where they go through, you know, because we are in this transition period. This is where it goes through and states that, you know, if you meet certain criteria, you should be using ISO now. Or at least looking forward to moving to that. So this is kind of the section where the FGDC addresses that policy.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, the GMD prefix specify. We're going to get into that in the XML section on XML basics next week, but those are called namespaces, and we will go over exactly, that's just the namespace definition, and wherever you see GMD is going to be where that kind of general metadata definition applies to. You mentioned that ISOs for purchase. What is the price? Let's see. I can go and check out. It really depends on the different standards and which ones you get. Let's see. The 19115, and of course you'd have to buy, you know, several of the 1915 series, the 191 series. Let's see how much it is real quick in the ISO. All right, and then it just directs me. I believe it was something around $60 a standard, if I'm not mistaken. But you'd have to buy several series of them. Yeah, on the FGDC site as well, and on our site, on the NCBBC site, it goes through how much they are. But the workbooks have a lot of that information for free. Can you add a new code list to the ISO profile? Yes, you can. We'll get into that a bit too. But if the current ISO code lists don't accurately describe your the information that you need, what you can do is you can host a code list online somewhere, or as long as it's publicly available. And then basically what you would do is you would just reference that code list. You would point to that URL and say, I'm using this term from this defined code list. Does ISO have standards for raster data? That is what you would use the -2 for. That's it. It's for gridded data, raster data. Which workbook should you use to learn? I would actually use the MI workbook because it incorporates everything in that the MD has. I'm a fan of using the -2, the 19115-2, because pretty much everything is measured with, all data is measured with, that I deal with at least, is measured via an instrument. Or has a platform or everything else. So I use the MI underscore metadata because everything that it adds on, it takes everything that's already in the MD, and then everything that it adds on is optional. So you could always shave off, but you can't add more later, or it's more difficult to. So the MI underscore metadata is what I would learn to really kind of walk through and work and use. Not a barrier for projects that interface with FED. Okay. Yeah, a lot of federal agencies have not moved to ISO yet. Again, we're in this transition phase of moving to ISO. It's not a barrier yet, but that it's a recommend. It's something that's policy states that you need to have, and more funding is getting cut for people that do not follow these standards. So it's a good thing to always have. How do we reconcile multiplicity defined as optional, but also with an indication that this is a NAP requirement? All right, if you see multiplicity as optional, that means according to the ISO metadata standards, it's optional. But if you're using a profile, such as the North American profile, and you want to follow that, that's just saying that that's mandatory. That's a mandatory element for the NAP. So what you would do is, it's more of a best practice. It's still ISO compliant, but you're adding additional mandatory features by using a certain profile, such as the European countries use a lot of Inspire, and it has a lot more different multiplicity issues as well, and some code lists and things like that that they choose from. So if you want to use the North American profile, you follow the ISO guidelines, but then you add these additional best practices into it. So just pick which one that you're going to follow. Yes, and all the endorsed recommended metadata standards are noted on the FGDC website. If you work for a federal, state, local government, or contractor, materials require a budget request and approvals. Exactly, which is why we helped develop the ISO workbook, so that you can get all the information for free rather than buying the standard. It's nice for every organization to own one set of the standards to refer to, but we know that that's not feasible all the time, which is why we developed the workbook, which should have all of that information. Our goal is to have 100% of the information from the standards in those workbooks, but the workbooks also give more information about implementation and examples, and that's freely distributable resource. What is the best software tool to create, edit ISO metadata? Tricky question because it depends on user preference. February 12th session, we're going to have an entire session on tools for ISO metadata. It's not an inclusive presentation. It's just the ones that we have found best and the ones that we have the most experience with and have had the best feedback from. So again, February 12th, we'll have that session on tools for ISO metadata. When will geoportals across the U.S. and ISO be updated to support ISO compliant records? All right, excellent. A lot of geoportals use ISO now. I know that we have one geoportal open that we use ISO metadata. And we have a lot of WAPs and everything that actually use ISO metadata. So there are several geoportals that are currently out there that do. The new geoportal actually out of the box, geoportal, if you're at the 1.2 version of it, supports ISO 19115 out of the box. Data.gov and geodata.gov support ISO metadata as well, and the new version that it's moving toward, called CCAN, will actually require everything to be an ISO metadata. There is a crosswalk reference that you can harvest metadata from, if you want that. Let's see. On the FTP site, there are transforms, and here's a crosswalk that is just a spreadsheet that kind of lists an element in FGDC and what it is in ISO. And these are called transforms, and they automate the creation going from FGDC to ISO, and we have some that go backwards from ISO back to FGDC. And we'll talk more in detail on that in the February 19th session called Creation Methods and Writing Metadata. And I see that some people have to support UK academic and they're ISO Inspire compliant. So yeah, that's where you can find a lot of the information there on how things relate between FGDC and ISO. I'm seeing, do we have any more questions? Okay. Locations of where to find code lists. Good question. In the workbooks, I'll pull up a workbook here so you can see one. Anywhere that there is reference to a code list, the workbook will actually tell you, go use this code list. Let me find one that has it. Okay. Presentation form, it says use this code list, and the workbook actually lists the values that are in that code list, but if you want more information, see Annex C, you can actually jump right to it, and this shows you the locations. The workbook has the locations of the code lists, as well as the each code list, their name, its code, and then the definition and some examples about that as well. Nathan Lowry, you had a question? Nathan Lowry? All right, Cindy, you had a question? We might be having some audio problems with a couple of people. Hernan, did you have a question?
No.
David Gonzalez? you have a question? Jamie Lynn, you have a question?
Yes, this is
Sorry, we're getting a lot of feedback. Would you mind emailing that or using the chat window? Michael Patrick?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So my interest in this is the federal government, state, local governments are opening up large amounts of their data, and there is this volunteer geographic information community out here, OpenStreetMap, OpenTopoMap, OpenSeaMap, including local citizens group that do water sampling and hikers with their sensors activated. And our accessibility to these standards documents is an issue in the sense that being able to refer somebody back to, you know, original source material, etc. Is there any plan for either individual agencies or the federal government as a whole just to open license or open source the standards documents? And if that's not the case, what are the restrictions if I got a copy of the ISO standard not to violate copyright by generating a workbook? Obviously, you had to come to some conclusion to distribute the standard via the workbook. What are the constraints?
Right. I work a lot with the ISO TC 211 working group, which is actually the Technical Committee 211, which is responsible for the updates to the ISO standard. And told if it was for educational purposes, that's not a violation of copyright code, and that the standards are meant to be the structure and the format, not an implementation guide. So they do not see this as a, and plus the ISO, they really get the majority of their income from other standards for, you know, electrical and mechanical issues, you know, that kind of stuff. Whereas geospatial metadata is not a huge moneymaker for them. So I don't think that they're really too concerned about, or they haven't been, because they all know about the workbook, or, you know, many of them are aware of it. And we haven't had any issues because it's for educational purposes for implementing their standards and using their standards. And of course, we always say, go by the standards, if, you know, that's always the baseline. But this is a workbook that contains all of that information. And plus, the UML is open from ISO. They'll provide you the UML and they'll provide the schemas, but they don't provide the definitions of that information that goes in there. And that's where the workbooks really come in, and plus all the examples. So that's how we got around it.
So if I were to spin a subset of your workbook, does your workbook fall under the general federal free for all citizens sort of category, or is it constrained by any of the ISO licensing?
No. At the beginning of this workbook, it actually, you know, there's a little thing that says this workbook's not in, it's our little lawyer blurb.
Yeah, I see.
But,
thank you very much.
Yeah. So it's you know, if you have any questions, refer to the standard, but this falls under public domain. This workbook is public domain, freely distributable. You know, the government's here to help thing.
Thank you.
All right. Asmat Ali, did you have a question? Oh, you want to try again? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. My question is about data validation, metadata validation. what kind of tool you would recommend, or would you elaborate this in later sessions? How we will validate metadata?
How do you validate the metadata?
Yes.
Again, using the 19139 standard, the XML schemas is how you validate it against a certain schema, and it depends on which tools that you're using. Again, we have February 12th, the tools for ISO metadata. We go into which tools, and then the February 26th edition goes into the validation. But quickly, you have to have the correct schemas associated with your XML metadata and the correct namespaces applied. And then you run your tool will check against those schemas and namespaces. I use something like XML Spy or Oxygen. I prefer XML editors, where other tools have that validation built in. But it's all against, most of the validation happens against a schema that you reference to in the header of the ISO standard. And that's available on the FTP. The schemas that you validate against are in the schemas folder, and for the ISO, you validate against this schema here. I will put this in the chat window so that you'll see that schema, but if you reference that schema in an XML editor, that's how you validate it. And I'll actually walk through that entire process in the February 26th session.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome. Nathan Lowry?
All right. Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I was just making note of the ISO standards that are available on the ANSI store, which include all of those mentioned for $30 except for 19157, which isn't yet available.
Correct. Yeah, that one's still in draft form. That should be released later this year.
Okay.
All right, we're running out of time for today. Again, if we did not get to your question, I'm sorry. If you email ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov, we can get to it. You know, and we can answer you offline. Also, please, if you have several people in your that are attending, please go ahead and email that list in. And with that, we'll see everybody next week for XML Basics. Thank you, everybody.